The rain hammered against the windows of the small coffee shop in downtown London, as Sergeant Marcus Thompson sat alone at a corner table. His large frame seemed cramped in the tiny chair, but he didn't mind. After 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless nights sleeping on rocky ground, a simple wooden chair felt like luxury. Marcus had been a United States Marine for 8 years, and the discipline showed in everything he did. His back was straight, his eyes constantly scanning the room, and his coffee cup sat perfectly centered on the table. Marcus wasn't in London for vacation. He was there for his sister's wedding, taking his first real break from military life in over 2 years. The bustling city felt strange after months in the desert, but he was trying to adjust. People rushed past the coffee shop windows, umbrellas bobbing up and down like black flowers in the rain. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry, which reminded him of home in Chicago. At the table across from him sat another man who also seemed different from the rushing crowd outside. This man was James Wellington, though Marcus didn't know his name yet. James was a member of the Queen's Guard, one of the elite soldiers who protected the royal family and their residences. He was out of uniform, wearing simple civilian clothes, but like Marcus, his military training was impossible to hide. His posture was perfect, his movements were controlled, and his eyes missed nothing. Both men had ordered their coffee at the same time, and both had chosen the same corner of the shop without realizing it. They sat about 10 feet apart, each lost in their own thoughts. Marcus was thinking about his sister's wedding tomorrow and hoping he wouldn't embarrass himself dancing. James was thinking about his duty, shift that started in 3 hours and the long night ahead of him, standing perfectly still outside Buckingham Palace. The coffee shop was nearly empty, except for the elderly owner behind the counter and a young woman typing on her laptop near the window. The atmosphere was peaceful, with only the sound of rain and the quiet hum of the espresso machine. Neither soldier spoke, but both were aware of the other's presence. It was like a sixth sense that came from years of training and combat experience. Marcus finished his coffee first and stood up to leave. As he walked toward the door, he accidentally bumped into James's chair. It was a small bump, barely noticeable, but James felt it immediately. He looked up and their eyes met for the first time. In that moment, both men recognized something familiar in each other. They saw the same steady gaze, the same alert posture, the same quiet confidence that came from serving their country. "Sorry about that," Marcus said in his deep American accent. "No worries," James replied in his crisp British accent. They nodded at each other with the kind of respect that soldiers give to other soldiers, even when they've never met before. Marcus continued toward the door, but something made him stop. He turned back and looked at James again. There was something about this stranger that intrigued him. Maybe it was the way he sat so perfectly still, or the way his eyes seemed to take in everything around him without moving his head. James was having the same thoughts about Marcus. He could tell this American was military just by the way he moved and carried himself. In James's line of work, being able to read people quickly was essential. He had spent years learning to spot threats and assess situations in seconds. This man was clearly no threat, but he was definitely someone worth knowing. The moment stretched between them, neither man quite sure what to do next. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and people continued to rush past with their umbrellas and newspapers held over their heads. Inside the coffee shop, time seemed to slow down as 2 warriors from different countries found themselves drawn to each other by an invisible bond of mutual respect and recognition. Marcus decided to trust his instincts. He walked back to James's table and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Mind if I sit? You look like someone who served." James nodded and motioned to the chair. "Please, and yes, I have." "Queen's Guard, you?" "U.S. Marines," Marcus replied as he sat down. "Just got back from my 3rd tour in Afghanistan." The 2 men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each sizing up the other. It was clear they were both professionals, both dedicated to their service, and both carried themselves with the quiet pride that came from defending their countries. The coffee shop owner looked over at them occasionally, probably wondering why 2 such serious-looking men had decided to sit together. "I've heard good things about the Marines," James said finally. "Tough training, tougher men." Marcus smiled slightly. Same could be said about the Queen's Guard, standing perfectly still for hours in all weather, protecting the royal family. "That takes a special kind of discipline. Different challenges," James agreed. But discipline is discipline, whether you're in the desert or outside a palace. They began to talk about their experiences, carefully avoiding classified information but sharing stories about training, brotherhood, and the unique challenges of military life. Marcus told James about the heat of Afghanistan and the bonds formed with fellow Marines in impossible conditions. James shared stories about the precision required for ceremonies and the intense responsibility of protecting some of the most important people in the world. As they talked, other customers came and went, but neither man paid them much attention. They were absorbed in their conversation, finding common ground despite coming from completely different military traditions. Marcus learned that James had been with the Queen's Guard for 6 years and had never missed a single day of duty. James learned that Marcus had saved 3 fellow Marines during an ambush in Kandahar and had been decorated for his bravery. "You know," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, "people always argue about which military is the best. Americans think we're the toughest. Brits think you're the most disciplined. Russians think they're the strongest. But sitting here talking to you, I realize we're all just trying to serve something bigger than ourselves." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's true. But there's still something to be said for national pride. Each country has its own way of forging warriors, and each believes their way is superior." "Speaking of that," Marcus said with a slight grin, "I've always been curious about something. You guards stand so perfectly still during ceremonies. Hours and hours without moving. Marines are trained for action, for movement, for quick responses. I wonder which takes more discipline." James raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting a competition?" "Not suggesting," Marcus replied. "Just wondering out loud. I mean, I could probably stand still for a while, but I've never tried it for hours like you do." "And I could probably handle action and movement," James said. "But I've never been tested in combat like you have." The idea hung in the air between them like a challenge that neither had explicitly made but both clearly understood. They weren't talking about fighting each other. They were talking about testing their different forms of discipline against each other. It was the kind of respectful competition that existed between elite units around the world. "There's a park across the street," James said, glancing out the window. "Wellington Park. It's got a memorial statue in the center. Nice open space. Rain's stopping too," Marcus observed. They looked at each other, and without saying another word, they both knew what was going to happen next. This wasn't about proving who was better or settling some international dispute. This was about 2 professionals testing themselves against each other in a way that honored both their traditions. It was about respect, discipline, and the curious human need to understand how we measure up against others who share our calling. 15 minutes? James suggested. "Make it 30, Marcus countered. "An hour," James said with the faintest smile. Marcus extended his hand across the table. "You're on." They shook hands firmly, sealing an agreement that neither fully understood yet but both felt compelled to honor. The rain had indeed stopped, leaving the streets of London glistening under the afternoon sun that was trying to break through the clouds. Marcus and James walked across the street to Wellington Park, their footsteps echoing off the wet pavement. Neither man spoke as they made their way to the memorial statue in the center of the park. It was a bronze figure of a World War I soldier, standing at attention with his rifle at his side. The park wasn't busy. A few joggers passed by, and an elderly man was feeding pigeons near a bench about 50 yards away. The setting felt appropriate somehow, peaceful but dignified, with the memorial watching over whatever was about to happen. When they reached the statue, both men stopped and looked at each other. The reality of what they were about to do was setting in. They had made an agreement in the warmth of the coffee shop, but now they were standing in public, about to engage in what could only be described as the most unusual competition either had ever participated in. "So how exactly do we do this?" Marcus asked. "I mean, what are the rules?" James considered the question seriously. "In the Queen's Guard, we stand at attention for ceremonial duties. Feet together, shoulders back, eyes forward, no movement whatsoever. We're trained to ignore everything around us, weather, crowds, even if someone tries to distract us." "And Marines?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "We're trained to stay alert, ready for action. We can stand still, but we're always watching, always ready to respond to threats. It's a different kind of discipline." They stood, facing each other about 6 feet apart, with the memorial statue between them. James positioned himself in the classic guard stance, feet together, back straight, hands at his sides, eyes looking straight ahead. Marcus took a similar position but with his feet slightly apart in a ready stance, his weight balanced, prepared to move if necessary. "We stand until one of us gives up or moves significantly," James said. "No talking, no communication. Just discipline against discipline." Marcus nodded. "And no time limit?" "Until it's finished," James replied. The elderly man, feeding pigeons, had noticed them now and was watching curiously from his bench. A jogger slowed down as she passed, clearly puzzled by the sight of 2 men standing perfectly still near the memorial. But neither Marcus nor James paid attention to their audience. "Ready?" James asked. "Ready," Marcus confirmed. And then they began. At first it felt almost easy for both men. They were used to discipline, used to controlling their bodies and minds. James fell into the familiar routine he had practiced thousands of times. His breathing was controlled, his muscles relaxed, but ready. His mind focused on the simple task of remaining perfectly still. This was what he had trained for, what he was best at. Marcus approached it differently. He kept his marine alertness, his eyes moving occasionally to scan their surroundings, his body ready to respond to any situation. He was standing still, but in an active way, like a coiled spring that could release energy instantly if needed. 20 minutes passed. The elderly man with the pigeons had finished feeding them and left. 2 teenagers walked by, pointing at the strange sight of 2 men standing motionless near the statue. A woman walking her dog stopped briefly to watch before continuing on her way. Both men were still standing strong, neither showing any signs of fatigue or discomfort, but already the differences in their approaches were becoming apparent. James looked like a statue himself, perfectly still and unchanging. Marcus looked alert and ready, his slight movements so small they were barely noticeable but still there. The sun came out fully now, warming the park and drying the remaining puddles on the paths. Neither man acknowledged the change in weather. They were locked in their competition, each drawing on years of training and discipline to maintain their position. At the 30-minute mark, Marcus felt his first real challenge. His legs were beginning to ache slightly from the unaccustomed stillness. He was used to action, to movement, to responding to his environment. Standing perfectly still was harder than he had expected. But he was a Marine, and Marines didn't quit. James, meanwhile, was in his element. 30 minutes was nothing to him. He had stood for hours in wind, rain, snow, and blazing sun. His body knew how to distribute weight, how to breathe, how to exist in a state of perfect stillness. But he was beginning to respect Marcus more and more as the American showed no signs of giving up. An hour had passed and word was beginning to spread through the park in the mysterious way that interesting events attract attention. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance watching the 2 soldiers stand motionless near the memorial. Some people took photos with their phones, others whispered to each other, trying to figure out what was happening. A local news reporter who had been in the area covering a different story noticed the unusual scene and approached with her cameraman. She spoke quietly to some of the onlookers, learning that 2 soldiers from different countries had been standing perfectly still for over an hour, in what appeared to be some kind of competition or demonstration. Marcus was really feeling the challenge now. His back ached, his feet were getting sore, and his body was screaming at him to move, to shift position, to do something other than stand in one place. But every time he felt like giving up, he thought about his fellow Marines who had endured far worse conditions. He thought about the motto Semper Fidelis and what it meant to never give up on your brothers or your mission. James was more comfortable physically, but he was facing a different kind of challenge. He was used to standing still while on duty, where his role was clearly defined and his purpose was obvious. Here, in this park with people watching and cameras recording, he felt a different kind of pressure. This wasn't just about personal discipline anymore. He was representing his unit, his tradition, and his country. The crowd had grown to about 30 people now, including several children who were fascinated by the spectacle. An elderly veteran approached the news reporter and explained that he recognized the stance of both men as military. He speculated that they might be testing their different forms of training against each other. "The American is a Marine. I'd bet my pension on it," the old veteran told the reporter. "See how he's still alert, still watching? That's Marine training. The British fellow, he's guard or something similar. Look at that perfect stillness. That's ceremonial discipline." Neither Marcus nor James heard these conversations, but they were both aware that they had an audience now. The pressure was building, not just from their own physical discomfort, but from the knowledge that people were watching, that this simple competition had somehow become something bigger. At the 90-minute mark, Marcus's right leg began to cramp. The pain shot up from his calf to his thigh, and for a moment he thought he might have to give up. He closed his eyes briefly, focusing on his breathing, using techniques he had learned for dealing with pain during torture resistance training. The cramp passed, but he knew he was reaching his limits. James noticed Marcus's momentary struggle and felt a surge of respect for the American. Most people would have given up long ago. The fact that Marcus was still standing, still fighting through obvious discomfort, proved that the reputation of the Marines was well earned. James himself was beginning to feel the strain now. His feet were going numb and his lower back was starting to ache. The news reporter was now doing a live broadcast, explaining the unusual scene to viewers across London. She spoke in hushed tones about the two soldiers who had been standing motionless for nearly 2 hours, describing it as a fascinating display of military discipline and international friendship. "This appears to be a friendly competition between two warriors from allied nations," she reported. "Both men are showing extraordinary discipline and endurance. The crowd here has been completely silent for the past 30 minutes, as if they understand they're witnessing something special." And the crowd was indeed silent now. What had started as curious chatter had evolved into respectful observation. People sensed that they were watching something significant, though none of them could quite put into words what it was. Children stood quietly next to their parents. Elderly people leaned on their walking sticks. Joggers had stopped their runs to watch. At 2 hours, neither man had moved significantly. Marcus had learned to distribute his weight differently, finding a stance that was sustainable even though it wasn't perfectly still. James remained statue-like, but small signs of strain were beginning to show in the slight tension around his eyes and the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. The afternoon sun was getting stronger now, adding heat to their physical challenges. Sweat began to form on both men's faces, but neither wiped it away. They were locked in a battle of wills now, each drawing on reserves of determination that went beyond physical training. 2.5 hours into their standoff, something unexpected began to happen. The crowd, which had been watching in respectful silence, started to change. Instead of just observing, people began to feel invested in what was happening. They weren't just watching a competition anymore. They were witnessing a testament to human determination and the bonds between soldiers. An elderly woman approached the memorial and quietly placed a small bouquet of flowers at its base. She looked up at both Marcus and James with tears in her eyes, whispered, "Thank you for your service," and walked away. A businessman who had stopped to watch during his lunch break decided to cancel his afternoon meetings and stay to see how this would end. Marcus was in serious trouble now. His entire body was screaming in protest, and he was beginning to see spots at the edges of his vision. The heat of the sun, combined with the physical strain of standing motionless for so long, was pushing him beyond his limits. But every time he thought about giving up, he looked at James, still standing perfectly still, and found new reserves of determination. James was also struggling, though he hid it better. His feet had gone completely numb an hour ago, and now that numbness was creeping up his legs. His back felt like it was on fire, and he was starting to worry about his circulation. But he could see that Marcus was in pain too, and something about the American's refusal to quit inspired him to keep going. The news story had gone viral on social media. People around the world were watching the live stream of two soldiers standing motionless in a London park. Comments poured in from veterans, active duty military personnel, and civilians from dozens of countries, all expressing amazement at the display of discipline and endurance. A group of British Army soldiers who had seen the news arrived at the park still in uniform. They stood at the edge of the crowd watching their American and British brothers with obvious pride and concern. One of them, a sergeant, recognized James and knew about the rigorous training of the Queen's Guard. He was amazed that anyone was still standing after this long. At 3 hours, the unthinkable happened. Marcus swayed slightly, just a tiny movement that most people wouldn't have noticed. But James saw it, and so did several people in the crowd. Marcus's body was finally betraying him, his muscles giving out after fighting exhaustion for so long. But instead of taking advantage of Marcus's weakness, something extraordinary occurred to James. He realized that this competition had become about something much bigger than proving who had better discipline. It had become about respect, about honor, about the brotherhood that existed between all soldiers regardless of their nationality. Marcus steadied himself and continued standing. But James could see the effort it was costing him. The American was running on pure willpower now, his body pushed far beyond its normal limits. James made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, James began to shift his weight. It was such a small movement that most of the crowd didn't notice it at first. But Marcus saw it, and he understood immediately what James was doing. The British soldier was giving him an honorable way out, showing that even he, with all his training in perfect stillness, had limits. The crowd began to murmur as they realized that both men were now moving slightly, both showing signs of the tremendous strain they had been under. The competition was ending, but not with victory or defeat. It was ending with mutual respect and recognition of each other's extraordinary abilities. A child in the crowd, a boy about 8 years old, broke free from his mother's hand and walked toward the two soldiers. He looked up at both of them with wide eyes full of admiration and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Are you both superheroes?" The question broke the spell that had held the park in silence for hours. People began to smile, then to clap, then to cheer. The applause started slowly but built until the entire crowd was giving both men a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. As the applause died down, both Marcus and James finally allowed themselves to move freely for the first time in over 3 hours. Marcus immediately dropped to one knee, his legs shaking from exhaustion and relief. James remained standing but allowed his perfect posture to relax, rolling his shoulders and stretching his neck carefully. The crowd surrounded them, but maintained a respectful distance. People were eager to talk to them, to understand what had just happened, but they seemed to sense that both men needed a moment to recover. The news reporter approached cautiously, her cameraman still filming. "Gentlemen, that was absolutely extraordinary," she said. "Can you tell us what just happened here? Was this planned?" Marcus looked up from where he was still kneeling, a smile spreading across his face despite his obvious exhaustion. "No, ma'am, it wasn't planned at all. We just met in a coffee shop an hour before this started." James, who was now sitting on the edge of the memorial's base, nodded in agreement. "We were just two soldiers having a conversation about discipline and service." One thing led to another. "And who won?" asked someone in the crowd. Both men looked at each other, and for the first time since their standoff began, they both laughed. It was a tired laugh, but genuine. "I think we both did," James said. "And I think we both lost, too." Marcus struggled to his feet, his legs still unsteady. "He's right. I learned something today about what real discipline looks like. Standing perfectly still like that for hours in all kinds of weather, protecting something important, that's not easy. And I learned something about marine adaptability," James replied. "You weren't trained for what we just did, but you found a way to endure it anyway." "That's impressive." The elderly veteran who had been watching from the beginning pushed through the crowd, tears in his eyes. "I served in Korea 60 years ago," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've never seen anything like what you two just did. You've shown everyone here what service really means, what sacrifice looks like." The group of British Army soldiers approached and snapped to attention, saluting both Marcus and James. Other veterans in the crowd followed suit, creating a spontaneous ceremony of respect that brought tears to many eyes. A paramedic who had been called by concerned onlookers checked both men to make sure they were okay. She was amazed to find that despite their obvious exhaustion, neither man showed signs of serious dehydration or injury. "Your training really shows," she told them. Most people would have collapsed long before 3 hours. The boy who had asked if they were superheroes tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why did they stand so still for so long?" His mother, who had been watching the entire time, knelt down to his level. "Because they're soldiers, sweetheart. They protect people, and sometimes that means doing very difficult things." They were showing each other respect. "Like saying thank you without words?" the boy asked. "Exactly like that," his mother replied. James heard this conversation and was struck by the child's simple understanding of what had just happened. That's exactly what it had been. A wordless conversation between two warriors. A way of saying thank you for your service and I respect what you do without ever speaking those words aloud. Marcus was finally able to stand steadily, though his legs still felt like rubber. I have to ask, he said to James, how do you do that for hours every day? How do you make your body ignore everything it wants to do? Practice, James replied simply. Years and years of practice, but also purpose. When you're protecting something or someone important, your body finds strength it didn't know it had. I felt that today, Marcus admitted. About halfway through, I wasn't standing there for the competition anymore. I was standing there because all these people were watching, because it meant something to them. The crowd was beginning to disperse now, but many people lingered, reluctant to leave. They had witnessed something unique, something that had touched them in a way they couldn't quite explain. The news reporter was wrapping up her broadcast, explaining to viewers that what they had seen was more than just a display of physical endurance. As the sun began to set over London, casting long shadows across Wellington Park, Marcus and James found themselves alone again for the first time since their ordeal began. The crowd had finally dispersed. The news crews had packed up their equipment, and the park had returned to its usual peaceful state. Both men sat on a bench near the memorial, sharing a bottle of water that someone from the crowd had given them. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each processing what had just happened and how it had affected them. You know, Marcus said finally, I came to London for my sister's wedding. I was supposed to be relaxing, taking a break from military life. Instead, I end up in the strangest competition of my life with a British soldier I'd never met. James smiled. I was supposed to report for duty 3 hours ago. I'll have some explaining to do when I get back to base. Will you get in trouble? Probably, James admitted. But it was worth it. I learned something important today. What's that? James was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I learned that discipline isn't just about following orders or standing perfectly still. It's about understanding why you do what you do and respecting others who serve that same purpose in their own way. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. I learned something too. I always thought Marine training was the toughest in the world, and maybe it is in some ways, but what you do standing guard for hours, protecting people without glory or recognition, that takes a different kind of strength. They sat in silence again, watching the last few people walk through the park as evening approached. A jogger ran past, the same woman who had slowed down to watch them hours earlier. She recognized them and gave them a thumbs up as she passed. Do you think people understood what happened here today? James asked. I think they understood the important part, Marcus replied. They saw two soldiers showing respect for each other and for what we represent. They saw that military discipline isn't about being a robot or showing off. It's about service and sacrifice. James's phone buzzed with a text message. He checked it and smiled. It's from my commanding officer. He says the Queen herself saw the news coverage and wants to meet both of us. Marcus's eyes widened. The Queen? Seriously? Seriously. And my CO says you're invited to visit our barracks tomorrow if you're interested. He wants to show you how we train. I'd be honored, Marcus said. And hey, if you're ever in the States, you should visit Camp Pendleton. I'd love to show you what Marine training looks like. They exchanged contact information and made plans to meet the next day. As they prepared to part ways, both men realized that what had started as a simple conversation in a coffee shop had turned into something much more significant. Marcus, James said as they stood up to leave. Thank you for today. I'll never forget it. Thank you too, James. And you know what? I think that little boy was right. Maybe we are both superheroes, just not the kind that wear capes. They shook hands firmly, then embraced briefly in the way that soldiers do when they recognize a kindred spirit. As they walked away in different directions, both men carried with them a new understanding of what it meant to serve, and a new respect for the different ways that warriors from different nations answer the call to protect others. The memorial statue watched over their departure, standing as it had for decades as a silent testament to service and sacrifice. And now it had witnessed something new, a wordless conversation between two modern warriors that had reminded everyone present that the bonds between those who serve transcend national boundaries and cultural differences. The story of the Marine and the Royal Guard would be talked about for years to come, not because of who won or lost, but because of what it revealed about honor, respect, and the universal language of military service that needs no words to be understood.